Jax's revenge domain. Are we seriously paying someone this much to babysit spreadsheets? Owen Walsh's voice cut through the glass-walled executive conference room like a blade. He stood at the head of the table, one hand pointing dramatically at the projection screen behind him, the other gripping his tablet like it contained smoking gun evidence of corporate waste. The spreadsheet displayed on the wall showed my compensation package highlighted in aggressive red, $685,000 annually, plus benefits and deferred bonuses tied to client retention metrics spanning 19 years of careful work. I was standing about 30 feet away near the coffee station, ceramic mug halfway to my lips, watching this performance through the transparent barriers of our open-concept executive floor. My name is Russell Parker. I'm 47 years old, and 6 months ago I was the Senior Director of Risk Architecture and Regulatory Compliance at Crest Global Solutions. That morning, I was about to become something else entirely. Owen Walsh was 34. Owen. His LinkedIn profile showed off his Wharton MBA, a brief stint at McKinsey, and 3 years as a consultant who specialized in tearing apart organizations without ever building anything that lasted. He'd joined Crest exactly 7 weeks earlier, arriving with the kind of supreme confidence that comes from dismantling companies without understanding what made them work in the first place. Through those glass walls, I had a perfect view of him holding court before our CFO, Perry Stone, 2 audit committee members, and our recently installed CEO, Margaret Foster. There were also 3 Vanguard board observers, including their lead investment director, Gloria Morgan, who'd been asking increasingly pointed questions during our quarterly reviews. This represents exactly the kind of bloated legacy spending that's choking our operational efficiency, Owen continued, expanding the spreadsheet to show departmental comparisons. We're bleeding money on positions that made sense in 2010 but are completely useless in today's automated world. I stayed perfectly still, watching with the detached interest of someone who'd witnessed similar corporate theater at 3 other companies during my career. The difference was, before I'd observed from a safe distance as other departments faced the efficiency axe. This time, the blade was aimed directly at me. What Owen Walsh didn't know, what none of them sitting in that conference room had bothered to discover, was that 4 years ago when Vanguard Capital Partners acquired Crest Global Solutions through a leveraged buyout, my attorney had negotiated something extraordinary into my employment agreement, something buried in Article 12, Section 7, Subsection D, something I'd outlined in explicit detail in a memorandum sent to legal counsel, human resources, and executive leadership exactly 19 days ago. That memo had been acknowledged with a brief email from our general counsel, Keith Coleman. Received. Will review and follow up as needed. Note, follow-up ever materialized. HR filed it in whatever digital graveyard they used for documents they considered procedural noise. And now, watching Owen circle my compensation like a predator who'd spotted wounded prey, I understood we were about to discover precisely what happens when new management ignores institutional warnings. By this time tomorrow, Crest Global Solutions would realize they hadn't simply eliminated a redundant position. They'd triggered a contractual cascade that would result in $850 million in combined client withdrawals, regulatory exposure, accelerated compensation clauses, and penalty provisions that would fundamentally alter the company's financial trajectory. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and explain how we got here. I'm a compliance guy, not exactly exciting at dinner parties. People's eyes tend to glaze over when I explain what I actually do. But that boring title represented the difference between a $6.8 billion company operating smoothly within complex regulatory frameworks governing financial services, and that same company facing catastrophic federal enforcement actions. I've been married to Linda for 25 years. She's a retired high school math teacher who still volunteers at the local library twice a week. Our son Brian is a 22-year-old sophomore at Cornell studying applied mathematics. Between his tuition, our mortgage on a colonial house in Westchester County, and the comfortable middle-class life we'd built over 2.5 decades of dual professional incomes, my $685,000 annual package wasn't excessive. It was appropriate compensation for someone who'd built and maintained the invisible infrastructure keeping a multi-billion-dollar company compliant with 23 different regulatory bodies across federal, state, and international jurisdictions. I studied economics at Columbia, then earned my law degree from NYU while working full-time as a compliance analyst at a mid-sized investment bank. I spent 6 years at the Securities and Exchange Commission as a senior examiner in their enforcement division. developing expertise in the exact regulatory frameworks that keep financial services companies from imploding under federal scrutiny. My time in the Navy before college had taught me discipline and attention to detail, qualities that served me well in both law school and regulatory work. Crest recruited me away from a direct competitor in 2005, right when the post-Enron regulatory landscape was reshaping the entire industry, and companies were desperately seeking people who understood both the letter and spirit of the new enforcement environment. Over 19 years, I'd built relationships with regulators, designed compliance systems, and prevented the kind of violations that could destroy a company overnight. My work wasn't the kind that generated headlines or closed major deals. I didn't manage profit and loss statements or pitch new clients. Instead, I designed and maintained the complex compliance architecture that allowed everything else to function. SEC regulations, FINRA oversight, state banking commissioners, international data privacy frameworks, anti-money laundering protocols, consumer protection statutes. Each regulatory body with its own requirements, reporting schedules, examination protocols, and enforcement philosophies. I knew which specific examiner at which particular agency cared about which compliance markers. I understood which regulations carried serious enforcement teeth and which ones were essentially performative box-checking exercises. I knew how to structure our systems so that when regulatory auditors arrived for surprise examinations, every document they requested was already organized, cross-referenced, and defensible. That knowledge doesn't transfer easily. It can't be distilled into a training manual or uploaded to a knowledge management database. It exists in pattern recognition developed across 19 years of watching regulatory environments evolve, understanding how enforcement priorities shift with political administrations, and building relationships with the actual decision makers who determine whether your company faces a warning letter or a $50 million penalty. Crest's client base consisted of 63 institutional investors, collectively managing $1.2 trillion in assets. Pension funds, university endowments, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies, mutual fund families. These weren't organizations that tolerated even the appearance of regulatory uncertainty. They purchased our analytic services and data platforms, but what they really bought was our compliance reputation. That reputation rested almost entirely on frameworks I'd designed, relationships I'd cultivated, and institutional knowledge I'd accumulated over nearly 2 decades. None of this registered as valuable to Owen Walsh when he arrived last October. Owen had been recruited directly by our new CEO, Margaret Foster, who joined 8 months earlier, following the Vanguard acquisition. Margaret came from a pure technology background. She'd spent 12 years at various Silicon Valley companies, most recently as COO of a cloud infrastructure provider that went public during the tech boom. She spoke fluently in the language of operational efficiency, scalable systems, and resource optimization. Her vocabulary included phrases like legacy cost structures and modernization initiatives, but notably lacked any deep understanding of regulatory complexity in financial services. Owen Walsh was her hand-picked hire, brought in to execute her vision for transforming what she repeatedly called our antiquated operational model into something more aligned with her previous tech industry experience. The problem was, financial services compliance isn't like optimizing server capacity or streamlining user interfaces. You can't simply upgrade to Compliance 2.0 and expect everything to work better. I first encountered Owen during an all-hands operations meeting in late October. He stood at the front of our largest conference room wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, radiating the particular brand of confidence that comes from never having experienced significant professional failure. Behind him, a presentation deck was already loaded, the title slide promising operational excellence through strategic transformation. I've dedicated my first 45 days to conducting a comprehensive operational audit, he announced, advancing to a slide showing various departmental expense ratios compared against what he termed industry optimization benchmarks. What I've discovered represents significant opportunity for structural improvement and cost rationalization. He talked enthusiastically about automation, artificial intelligence-driven compliance monitoring, and eliminating what he called redundant human oversight in areas where technology solutions had matured sufficiently. His slides compared our compliance expenditures to carefully selected industry benchmarks, companies that had either faced substantial regulatory penalties in recent years or hadn't existed long enough to encounter serious enforcement scrutiny. We are substantially overstaffed in certain legacy functions, he said, his eyes scanning the assembled employees with practiced concern. Not because anyone has underperformed individually, but because our operational approach hasn't evolved to leverage modern technological capabilities. I could see heads nodding around the room. To people unfamiliar with the intricacies of financial compliance, Owen's presentation sounded reasonable, even visionary. Why wouldn't you want to eliminate inefficiencies and embrace cutting-edge solutions? After the meeting concluded, he intercepted me near the elevator bank. Russell, correct? He extended his hand with a smile that projected warmth without reaching his eyes. I'd like to schedule time with you next week. Detailed discussion about your department structure and deliverables. Of course, I replied. Happy to walk through our compliance architecture and regulatory frameworks. Perfect. And please bring comprehensive documentation about your systems and processes. I want to understand what can be automated effectively and what genuinely requires human judgment and expertise. That conversation should have served as my first clear warning signal. But I'd survived 4 corporate acquisitions, 6 different CEOs, and countless reorganization initiatives during my career. I knew how to document value, how to demonstrate necessity through metrics and risk assessments. I'd weathered storms before by proving my worth through data and results. I wasn't particularly concerned. In retrospect, that confidence was naive. The meeting occurred the following Thursday in Owen's newly renovated office on the executive floor. He'd already redecorated completely: minimalist Scandinavian furniture, a height-adjustable standing desk, 3 large monitors displaying real-time operational dashboards that he probably didn't fully comprehend. The walls were bare except for his framed MBA diploma and a motivational poster about disrupting the status quo. Russell, thanks for making time, he said, gesturing toward a chair positioned across from his desk. I've been conducting a detailed review of your department's budget allocation and resource utilization. Walk me through why regulatory compliance requires this level of investment. I spent 50 minutes explaining our regulatory landscape in detail, the jurisdictional complexity spanning federal and state authorities, the relationship management with 37 different agency contacts across multiple regulatory bodies, the customized reporting frameworks required for each distinct client segment, the audit preparation protocols that had kept us violation-free and penalty-free for 11 consecutive years. Owen nodded periodically, taking notes on his tablet, asking questions that initially seemed thoughtful but gradually revealed fundamental gaps in his understanding of our operational reality. Couldn't the majority of this monitoring be handled through existing platforms? He asked about halfway through my presentation. I've been briefed on several vendors offering AI-driven compliance solutions at a small fraction of current personnel costs. Those platforms are useful tools, I explained patiently. They're effective for data aggregation, initial screening, and automated reporting generation. But regulatory compliance in financial services isn't simply about checking boxes on standardized forms. It requires judgment calls on gray areas where regulations overlap or conflict. It requires relationship management when issues arise that need contextual discussion rather than automated responses. It requires institutional knowledge about how different regulators prioritize different concerns based on current enforcement trends. Give me a concrete example, he said, leaning back in his ergonomic chair. Last year, we identified a data reporting anomaly with one of our pension fund clients, the Ohio State Teachers Retirement System. The raw numbers in their filings technically met regulatory requirements, but I noticed a pattern inconsistency suggesting a calculation error in their upstream vendor systems, not in our data. An automated system would have flagged everything as compliant and moved to the next review item. I paused, letting that sink in. Instead, I called their chief compliance officer directly, walked through my analysis, and we discovered they had a vendor integration problem that would have cascaded into a substantial ERISA violation within 90 days if left uncorrected. And they appreciated that intervention. They renewed their contract for 4 years and upgraded their service tier to include expanded compliance consulting. That account generates $18 million annually in revenue. More importantly, it strengthened our reputation in the public pension fund market segment, which led to 3 additional client acquisitions over the following 18 months, worth another $45 million combined. Owen made another note on his tablet. Interesting case study, but is that approach sustainable as we scale operations? Can we really afford to have senior personnel making individual judgment calls on every potential anomaly? That word, sustainable, became his favorite weapon over the following weeks. Every conversation, every email exchange, every casual interaction in the hallway eventually circled back to whether my role, my team, my entire operational approach was sustainable given the company's evolution toward what he termed modern efficiency standards. I started documenting everything meticulously. Every question he posed, every suggestion he made, every hint that my position was being evaluated not for performance outcomes, but for cost reduction opportunities. My Navy training had taught me the importance of maintaining detailed records, and that habit served me well in corporate environments where memories could become conveniently selective. In mid-November, I had lunch with Dennis Brooks, an old colleague who'd recently departed from a competitor after their compliance director was terminated during a strategic restructuring initiative. We met at a quiet steakhouse in Midtown, the kind of place where financial services professionals conduct sensitive conversations over expensive meals. "Let me guess the pattern," Dennis said after I described Owen's persistent questioning about operational sustainability. He cut into his ribeye with the resigned precision of someone who'd seen this movie before. New executive consulting background thinks regulatory compliance is basically a software subscription you can purchase instead of actual expertise. "That's essentially accurate," I replied. "He keeps asking why we can't just automate everything with AI-driven platforms." Dennis laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Russell, they terminated. Our director 4 months ago replaced her with a less experienced manager and a tech platform that cost $200,000 annually. Want to know what happened last month? Tell me." FINRA showed up for a routine spot examination. They found 23 documentation gaps, 9 reporting inconsistencies, and 3 potential material violations. We're now facing enforcement penalties in the 8-figure range. Plus, we've lost 3 major institutional clients who cited compliance concerns in their contract termination letters. He paused to take a sip of wine, letting the implications sink in. The director we fired tried warning them during her exit interview. She documented every single risk in writing. They didn't care because they were saving $450,000 annually on her salary and benefits. Now they're facing $30 million in regulatory fines and another $60 million in lost revenue from client defections. I drove back to the office thinking about that conversation, about the predictable pattern of organizations that mistake cost-cutting for strategic efficiency. These companies always learn the same lesson the hard way, that some roles can't be optimized away without catastrophic consequences. That evening, I retrieved my employment contract from our home office file cabinet and read through it carefully for the first time in 4 years. Linda was grading papers in the living room while I spread the documents across my desk under the warm glow of my reading lamp. Article 12, Section 7, Subsection D practically leaped off the page. This language had been negotiated by my attorney Carol Fisher during the Vanguard acquisition process. At that time, the private equity firm's due diligence team had identified significant key person risk concentrated in my specific role. The contractual language was their protective mechanism, a way to ensure that if my institutional knowledge disappeared suddenly, there would be financial consequences substantial enough to discourage careless management decisions. The clause specified that if my position was eliminated or materially restructured without following specific protocols, including a 240-day transition period, formal board approval, documented risk mitigation plans, and client notification procedures, it would trigger automatic acceleration of all deferred compensation, unvested equity grants, and performance bonuses tied to client retention metrics accumulated over the life of my employment. More significantly, it included penalty provisions if my departure caused disruption to client contracts. Several of our largest institutional clients had contractual continuity clauses requiring notification and approval of any changes to senior compliance personnel. Those clauses weren't suggestions or preferences. They were contractual rights with termination provisions allowing clients to exit agreements without penalty if those requirements weren't satisfied. I'd warned Vanguard about these complexities during the acquisition due diligence phase. They'd built these protections specifically because their financial analysis clearly demonstrated what would happen if institutional knowledge concentrated in key roles disappeared suddenly without proper succession planning. But that was 4 years ago. New executive leadership, New operational priorities, new managers who hadn't participated in those original negotiations and apparently hadn't bothered reviewing the documentation that came with their acquisition. Linda appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. "You look troubled," she observed, setting one mug on my desk. "Work problems?" "Potentially," I said. "The new VP seems determined to eliminate my position as part of his efficiency initiative." She sat in the chair across from my desk, the same spot where we'd discussed Brian's college applications 2 years earlier. "Are you concerned about finding another job? Your reputation in the industry is solid. It's not about finding another position, Linda. It's about them understanding what they're actually eliminating." I showed her the contract language, walked through the protection clauses Carol had negotiated, explained the client contract implications in detail. Linda read through everything with the methodical attention she'd once applied to reviewing her students' algebra homework. "They really didn't review any of this?" she asked finally. "The current leadership team wasn't part of the original acquisition negotiations. Owen's been here less than 2 months. Margaret came from a completely different industry where regulatory compliance means something entirely different. They see numbers on a spreadsheet representing cost, not the invisible systems that protect those numbers from regulatory catastrophe. What happens if they proceed with their plan? Then they learn what expensive actually means." On November 18th, I drafted and sent a formal memorandum to Owen Walsh, Margaret Foster, our general counsel Keith Coleman, and our board liaison, Gloria Morgan. The subject line was direct: compliance role restructuring, contractual considerations and risk assessment. I outlined Article 12, Section 7, subsection D explicitly, including the full text of the clause. I detailed the client contract implications, attaching a comprehensive spreadsheet showing which specific institutional clients had continuity requirements in their master service agreements. I included a detailed risk assessment projecting potential exposure if my role was eliminated without following the contractual protocols. The document was 12 pages long, meticulously researched and professionally devastating in its implications. Owen responded within 90 minutes via email. "Thanks for the input, Russell. We'll take this under advisement as we finalize our operational planning." Keith Coleman, our general counsel, sent a separate message. "Russell, I'll review the contractual language with our outside counsel and coordinate with HR. Appreciate you flagging this." That was the entirety of their response. No follow-up meeting, no detailed review session, no indication they understood the magnitude of what I'd outlined. Just acknowledgement and filing away. Probably in the same digital graveyard where they'd stored countless other documents they considered procedural noise. 3 weeks later, I received a calendar invitation that confirmed my worst suspicions. Strategic Workforce Planning Session. Executive Conference Room. All leadership. Date: December 6th. Time: 9 a.m. I knew immediately what this meeting represented. The choreography was too familiar from observing similar sessions at previous companies during my career. These weren't collaborative discussions about organizational development or strategic workforce allocation. They were carefully scripted termination events designed to create the illusion of due process, while witnesses documented that proper procedures had been followed. The corporate equivalent of a show trial with predetermined outcomes and performative deliberation. I had 3 weeks to prepare for what would either be the end of my career at Crest Global Solutions or the beginning of the most expensive lesson in institutional knowledge management that any of them had ever received. Sitting in our kitchen that evening, watching Linda prepare dinner while the December sun set early outside our windows, I felt remarkably calm. Sometimes preparation and patience converge with opportunity in ways that create perfect clarity about what needs to happen next. The night before the meeting, I sat in our home office reviewing my comprehensive documentation folder. Every email exchange, every memo, every warning I'd sent over the past 2 months was organized in chronological order. Linda came in around 10:30 p.m. carrying tea and her reading glasses. "You're still working," she observed, setting the mug on my desk next to the neat stacks of papers. "Final preparation for tomorrow's meeting," I said. "The workforce planning session." She'd overheard enough of my phone conversations with Carol Fisher over the past month to understand something significant was developing. Are they really going through with it? All indications suggest yes. She sat in the familiar chair across from me, her practical mind already processing scenarios. "Russell, whatever happens tomorrow will be fine. Brian's tuition is manageable, the mortgage has only 6 years left, and your reputation will open doors anywhere." I know we'll manage financially, I said, but this isn't primarily about finding my next position. This is about them learning to value institutional knowledge before they destroy it carelessly. I arrived at the office at 8:45 a.m. on December 6th. The executive conference room occupied the northeast corner of our 28th floor headquarters, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Manhattan and the East River. It was a beautiful setting for what was essentially a corporate execution. Margaret Foster sat at the head of the polished conference table, her expression professionally neutral. Owen Walsh positioned himself to her right, laptop already connected to the projection system, radiating the confidence of someone who believed he was about to solve a major operational inefficiency. Keith Coleman reviewed documents on his tablet with unusual intensity. Perry Stone, our CFO, looked distinctly uncomfortable, adjusting his tie repeatedly and avoiding direct eye contact with anyone. The 3 Vanguard board observers were also present, including Gloria Morgan, whose sharp financial mind had been asking increasingly pointed questions about operational risks during recent quarterly reviews. Owen stood and activated his presentation. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending this important workforce optimization session. As we approach year-end planning and prepare for next fiscal year, it's essential we examine our organizational structure with fresh perspective and strategic clarity. First slide appeared, Operational Excellence through Strategic Restructuring. Today's discussion focuses on legacy operational roles that may no longer align with our growth trajectory and modern operational capabilities, he continued smoothly. The next slide showed our departmental expense breakdown. Regulatory compliance represented 31% of operational overhead, highlighted in bright red with an arrow pointing specifically to my position and compensation package. Now, I want to be absolutely clear, Owen said, his tone carefully modulated for maximum reasonableness. This discussion isn't about individual performance or historical contributions. Russell Parker has been a valued team member throughout his tenure at Crest. However, compliance technology has advanced substantially over the past decade. Automated platforms can now handle regulatory monitoring with 99.7% accuracy at a fraction of current personnel costs. Past tense. Has been a valued team member, not is. The language choice was deliberate and telling. Another slide appeared. Compliance Modernization Roadmap, Phase 3, showed legacy role transition with estimated annual savings of $740,000. No name was listed, but everyone in the room knew exactly which position that represented. Gloria Morgan from Vanguard spoke up, her voice measured and professional. What's the proposed transition timeline here, and what risk mitigation protocols are being implemented? Excellent questions, Owen replied smoothly. We're proposing a 90-day knowledge transfer period to our newly hired compliance manager, with full transition to automated monitoring systems by March 1st. 90 days. Not the 240 days explicitly required by my contract. Keith Coleman raised his hand slightly. Have we conducted a comprehensive review of the contractual implications of this restructuring? HR has confirmed that all employment agreements include standard at-will termination provisions, Owen said confidently. This is a legitimate business efficiency decision fully within our operational authority. Standard provisions. He clearly hadn't read Article 12, Section 7, Subsection D, or he'd read it and fundamentally misunderstood its implications. Any other questions before we move to implementation specifics? Owen asked, scanning the room with practiced confidence. I could have remained silent. Could have let them continue their presentation, signed whatever paperwork they'd prepared, accepted their severance package, and congratulated themselves on decisive leadership and operational efficiency. But sometimes the most effective tactical response is the one nobody anticipates. I stood slowly, reached into my leather portfolio, and placed a sealed manila envelope directly in front of Margaret Foster. I'd like to save everyone considerable time and legal expense, I said calmly. The room went completely silent. Owen's confident expression flickered momentarily, like a television signal experiencing interference. Russell, there's no need for theatrical gestures, Margaret said, attempting to maintain control of the meeting. We haven't even discussed the transition support package and severance arrangement yet. I removed my building access badge and security credentials from my wallet, placing them precisely on top of the envelope. The plastic hitting the polished wood made a sharp sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Inside that envelope is my resignation, effective immediately, I said, looking directly at Margaret. Also included is a copy of Article 12, Section 7, Subsection D of my employment agreement, along with a detailed analysis prepared by my attorney regarding contractual exposure and client contract implications. I believe your legal team will want to review this material very carefully and very quickly. Keith Coleman had already reached for the envelope. He opened it with the careful precision of someone handling potentially explosive material, scanned the first page, then flipped to the contract excerpt I'd highlighted. I watched his face transform incrementally, eyes widening, jaw tightening, color draining slightly as the implications became clear. "What does it say?" Margaret asked, her voice sharp now, the professional neutrality cracking visibly. Keith looked at Owen, then at Gloria Morgan, then back at the documents. "It's a key person protection clause. If Russell's role is terminated or materially restructured without a 240-day transition period and formal board approval, it triggers immediate acceleration of all deferred compensation, unvested equity grants, and performance bonuses accumulated over his entire tenure." The room went completely quiet except for the subtle hum of the building's HVAC system and the distant sound of Manhattan traffic far below. "How much acceleration are we discussing?" Perry Stone asked, his voice strained. Keith was still reading, his finger tracing lines of text with increasing concern. 14 years of deferred performance bonuses indexed to client retention metrics and company valuation. Equity adjustments tied to the Vanguard acquisition terms. Plus, he paused, reading more carefully, plus penalty provisions if his departure causes client contract disruptions. Several major institutional clients have termination rights if senior compliance personnel change without proper notification and approval. Owen had gone visibly pale. That wasn't included in the HR summary documentation. HR doesn't review executive protection clauses, Keith said quietly. Those are negotiated directly during acquisitions and maintained by legal counsel. They're not part of standard employment documentation. I pushed my chair back from the table with deliberate calm. "Thank you for the opportunity to contribute here over the past 19 years. I wish everyone stability and success in the coming months." As I walked toward the door, I heard Margaret's voice, tight and controlled now. "Keith, what's our total exposure here? Give me a preliminary number." I didn't wait for his answer. The door closed behind me with a soft click that felt remarkably final. By the time I reached the parking garage, my phone was already buzzing insistently. 6 missed calls from office numbers I recognized but chose not to answer. There's a specific window after a decision like this. Too early for consequences to materialize, too late for prevention. I sat in my Lexus for several minutes, looking back at the glass and steel tower that housed 940 employees who had no idea what was about to unfold across the next several weeks. 3 days later, Lance Morrison from Vanguard called personally. "Russell, the board recognizes there were substantial failures in how this restructuring was handled. We'd like to resolve this efficiently." The final settlement was executed within a week, $11.4 million in accelerated compensation, plus consulting fees to help transition my institutional knowledge properly. Owen Walsh was quietly reassigned to special projects. Margaret Foster announced her departure 2 months later. Within a month, Susan Palmer from Sovereign Risk Advisors in Boston called with an offer I couldn't refuse. Senior partner, equity stake, complete autonomy to build my own team. Today, sitting in my corner office overlooking Boston Harbor, I've learned that the most satisfying professional revenge isn't emotional or vindictive. It's contractual, documented, and entirely self-executing. Sometimes you have to walk away from everything you've built to discover what you're genuinely worth. And when you finally find people who see you as the solution instead of the problem, you know you've made the right decision. The real lesson here isn't about contracts or revenge. It's that your true value becomes crystal clear only when someone tries to throw it away. Sometimes the most expensive education a company can receive is learning the difference between what something costs and what it's actually worth.